So, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Autism Training and Technical Assistance Project monthly webinar for March. We are excited that you're joining us this morning. Thank you for those of you who are saying good morning in the chat. We appreciate that. My name is Kirsten Bayer, and I am with the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support at Illinois State University. I'm the Assistant Director of Communications. Here's my email and contact information if you need to follow up with me following today's webinar for any of the information. I'm happy to share that with you or follow up with the presenter for you. And if you need anything during today's session, please feel free to reach out to me via the chat. Couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We are on Zoom webinar today. So you as an attendee, you do not have the opportunity to unmute yourself or turn on your video camera. But that is because we are on a Zoom webinar platform. So it's different than Zoom meeting, which you're probably all familiar with. But we would love for you to be able to speak freely with the presenter during our Q&A at the end of the session. So if you would like to ask a question live, or if you have a comment live during the end of the session when we pause for Q&A, you can feel free to raise your Zoom hand, your virtual Zoom hand on your Zoom toolbar, and I can unmute you. So it's a little bit more controlled, but we do welcome that participation via your microphone towards the end of the session. You can also participate via the chat or the Q&A. You can ask any questions or pose any comments. We welcome that and we appreciate it. We're joined today by our presenter, Amy Gravino. We're excited to welcome her back, and she's actually going to be our keynote speaker on a presentation on autism and sexuality at our autism conference, which is going to be April 3rd. And so if you haven't registered for our autism conference, we encourage you to do so. It's going to be April 3rd at the Bone Student Center in Bloomington Normal on Illinois State University's campus. Registration is really affordable. I believe it's $25. And I can put the registration link for our conference in the chat if you're interested, or if you have instructors or administrators that would be interested. We're going to be joined by Amy Gravino and also another presenter that we've had on some of our ADA webinars. Hallie Moss is doing a session at our conference for us. And she is a neurodiversity lawyer. And so we're excited to welcome her back as well. So just a quick disclaimer and plug in there for our autism conference. Today's session is titled Social Validity, and we're excited to hear from Amy about that. A little bit about the ADA project, if you're not familiar with us or if you're new to joining us on our project. The ADA project develops and presents resources that assist with individuals with autism or autistic individuals in their transition piece. So we specifically focus on the transition from either secondary education to post-secondary, or from secondary to the workforce. And our stakeholders are individuals with autism or autistic individuals, but also parents of those individuals, employers, community members, or siblings, family members. So we have all different stakeholders, and we want to provide these professional development sessions to really provide that support, so you can provide support to the individuals with autism in your life during that transitional piece of their lives. And so I'm going to use individuals with autism or autistic individuals interchangeably today. Just want to make that disclaimer. A little bit about ICSPS, or the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support, if you're not familiar with us, is that we are founded in the EAF, or Educational Administration and Foundations Department, within the College of Ed at ISU. We've been around since 1977, and we specifically focus on equity, access, diversity, and inclusion in recruitment, retention, completion, and transition for students, for post-secondary learners, for secondary learners, enhance recruitment and retention, and support special population students specifically. And this project is very near and dear to our heart. We've had it for many years. Here's our website. We are funded by ISB, or the Illinois State Board of Education, who funds this project, and we partner with them. You can access all of our monthly webinars and resources and information about our conference on the autismcollegeandcareer.com. For our conference, we are actually partnering with the A+ project, if you're familiar with that. And so the ADA and A+ project are partnering to bring you the autism conference. And so we're excited about that. Couple of polls before we get started with Amy and her presentation. I'll just go ahead and launch both of them now. We'd love to know which region you're located in. And then we'd also love to know which ADA stakeholder you represent. And the add a stakeholder poll is multiple choice. So feel free to answer that. And you can put if you're a post-secondary educator and a family member. So you can answer multiple choice on the second poll there. So they're both up now. You should be able to scroll and go ahead and answer those. So we appreciate your participation in answering the polls, excuse me. And then another housekeeping thing, just while you're answering the poll, is that today's webinar is going to be recorded and it will be up on our website, that autismcollegeandcareer.com, within about 48 working business hours. You'll also have a follow-up email tomorrow, which will include a survey. We do welcome your participation on that survey. We use the surveys during our autism stakeholder planning development committee that we have, filled with members from state representation, members from parents and other stakeholders who are on that committee, as well as ISB representation. We have ICCB, Illinois Community College Board representation on that committee. And that committee looks at all of your surveys to develop this professional development for the whole year. So we do welcome your feedback on that because we do look at the surveys. I know surveys can be tedious, but all right. I appreciate you answering the polls. So it looks like we have a lot of people joining us from Chicago or Northeast Illinois, as well as Central and Southwest Illinois. So thank you. And we have a lot of secondary and post-secondary educators, but we also have a student or young adult on with us and a family member and an employer. So thank you so much for joining, and we appreciate your participation. And I'm going to stop sharing my slides and hand it off to Amy to share hers and get her presentation started.
Thank you so much, Kirsten. Really appreciate it. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Just give me a moment. Okay, get this into mode. Okay, so pleasure to be here with you all again. Hopefully you're not tired of seeing my face by now. And as Kirsten mentioned, I'll be keynoting at the ATA conference on April 2nd. So April 3rd, excuse me. And so I'm excited to see you all there if you're able to make it. Today's talk is titled Social Validity and the Spectrum, Finding the Rhythm of Autism in the Heart of ABA. And so this is kind of more centrally focused around the field of applied behavior analysis, but it is also applicable, I think, to any professional who is working with individuals on the spectrum, and to really everyone who is someone who supports and loves a person on the spectrum. I originally gave this talk at the ABAI National Conference last year. I was the inaugural speaker for the Montrose Wolf Social Validity and Outreach Speaker Series, so that's where this came out of, and I'm very happy to be able to share this information with you today. And I want this to, be a discussion. Please don't feel that you just have to sit here and listen to me this whole time. Feel free to use the chat if you have comments that you would like to make, or also the Q&A feature is available for you to put questions in, and Kirsten will be monitoring that so that we'll make sure we get to all of your questions at the end. But again, I would love for this to really be a discussion and conversation. I want to hear what you all think and what is on your mind. So always feel free to speak up. So just an overview of some of the topics that I'll be touching on in today's talk. I'll be giving kind of an overview. What is social validity? First of all, I think it's important we start off with a definition of what that means, what it means within the framework of applied behavior analysis. And then, because I think that it might have a slightly different meaning when we're talking about outside of the field of ABA, but just for our purposes, how it's defined within that and what social validity looks like also. And then we'll be talking about how can we make social validity meaningful, right? So that's kind of the biggest challenge when we're talking about collecting social validity with individuals on the spectrum, making this something that's meaningful. I mean, there's been in the field in particular of ABA, there's been kind of a drop off in measuring social validity in recent years. And we'll talk about why that is, why somehow that has become less important to many clinicians and behavior analysts, and why it really should still be important. It has to be, in fact, essential to everything that we do to support autistic individuals. And also how we can make it meaningful both to the field and to the autistic people that we work with and to their families and the community as a whole. And then I'll be talking about some of the barriers might be to collecting social validity with autistic clients. And again, these are not by any stretch of the imagination barriers that are created by the clients. These just come, I think, a lot from the environments in which we try to collect social validity and the means by which we attempt to collect that social validity, and how they are traditionally more geared toward people who are able to give really precise feedback, right? And how we have a narrow idea of what is socially valid, and how that becomes kind of this vicious cycle, and that makes us look for certain things and then interpret the absence of those things as the absence of social validity, or more frequently, the presence of certain things is often assumed to be the presence of social validity when it may not be. So we'll be talking about some of that. And we'll have strategies as well for how can we facilitate, right, social validity with people on the spectrum, in collaboration with autistic individuals, and also in collaboration with families, and in collaboration with clinicians and the community at large. How can we look at all of those elements and find ways to collaborate when it comes to social validity? And of course, as I said, we'll have time for questions, plenty of time for questions at the end. So this is, in 1978, Montrose Wolf published a seminal paper on social validity. This was published in the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, and it was the first of its kind. Nobody prior to Wolf had really talked about social validity, what that meant when it came to working with individuals with disabilities, or with anyone really. And this is one of I'm pulling a few quotes from his paper, and this was the first one that really stood out to me. Behavioral treatment programs are designed to help someone with a problem. It is the participants and other consumers who want to make the final decision about whether a program helps solve their problems. And that to me is kind of the thesis statement of what we're talking about, right? So we're talking about helping people with problems. We're talking about helping autistic individuals with the things that they're struggling with. But oftentimes that decision about whether something was helpful doesn't end up in the hands of the autistic individual, right? That decision is often put in the hands of parents, or in the hands of a caregiver, or literally kind of anybody else except for the client, the individual who is the recipient of the services. So that was what kind of I saw as the starting off point for what we're talking about today. Who is the consumer? Who is the person who should have the most say and the final decision about whether a program of any kind helps an autistic person in whatever capacity we're talking about? So I'm speaking in very general terms, but you'll see what I mean as we continue on. So what is social validity, right? Well, how is it defined? Montrose Wolf laid out three very distinct elements of what social validity consists of, which is the social significance of the goals that we set. So when we're talking about creating a program for folks on the spectrum, we set goals, right? So social validity speaks to the social significance of the goals. Try saying that 5 times fast. She sells seashells by the seashore. But the second element of that is the social appropriateness of the procedures, right? So that's the second piece. What are the procedures that we're looking at, that when we're trying to help individuals on the autism spectrum? Is what we're doing appropriate? Now, appropriate, again, can be, I think, a pretty subjective thing. Who decides what's appropriate and what's not? For my money, what I think of when I hear about social appropriateness is, are we choosing something that is appropriate developmentally for the person, where they're at in terms of development? Is it appropriate for them for where they are chronologically, their age? We don't want to be doing things with, for example, with adults on the spectrum that would be more appropriate for children, things that are not meeting where one is at, because of, again, our tendency to kind of infantilize a lot of adults on the spectrum and things of that nature. But are the procedures appropriate in terms of how the world perceives these procedures as well, right? So social appropriateness can mean, is this something that someone who has no experience with ABA might look at and say, oh yeah, that's that seems acceptable, that's not harming this person, it's not causing them distress in any way. And so I think social appropriateness can have many different dimensions to it. Those are just some of the dimensions. But then the third aspect of social validity that Wolf outlined is the social importance of the effects or outcomes, right? So when you're thinking about, how are we going to do something to help an autistic individual learn a skill or perform a certain task, we always have to be thinking of the end product, right? Not only what will the potential outcome be of whatever it is we're undertaking, but what could the long-term effects be, right? Because all too often we want to put together an intervention or a strategy for people on the spectrum, and and the focus is often on that immediacy. What is the immediate outcome going to be? Is this person going to be able to do this skill, or will there be a reduction in this behavior? But we lose sight of the long-term effects, I think. Are the effects going to be something that will ultimately be beneficial to the autistic person, or could they potentially have unintended harmful long-term effects, right? And is the social importance of the outcomes in that immediate moment, is that going to be as strong down the line, right? So, a great example would be teaching somebody how to tie their shoes, right? That's pretty important in the immediate moment, of course. But just as easily, you could, so if somebody has so much trouble with tying their shoes, you could just give them Velcro shoes, right? So is that something that is going to carry right through the rest of their lives? Are they going to always need to know how to tie their shoes, or could there be something that will supplant that will ultimately make that easier? And that's a weird example, and I apologize for it, but that was the first one that came to mind. But there's a lot of others, that we can look at. But again, or another one could be, for example, teaching somebody what all the names of the different colors are, right? Sure, it's a great skill to know the names of the different colors, but then we think about what my dear friend and colleague Dr. Peter Gerhardt has referred to as socially oh God, what's the word? My brain just went completely blank. But he refers to them as adaptive skills, right? So, okay, somebody, it's important in that moment that this person learns all the names of the colors, but then they still can't cross the street by themselves, right? So long term, is it going to be as important for them to be able to name all the colors as it is for them to be able to cross the street by themselves, for example? However, again, it's all contextual. It could be applicable. This person could grow up to be an artist. And in that case, it is important that they know all the names of the colors. But just looking at kind of the differential between those two things, I think is really important. So these are the three elements that Wolf outlined in his paper about what social validity means in a behavior analysis context. And but when we look at actually putting the practice of measuring social validity into practice, it's not always happening in the way that we might like. So this study came out in 2016 from Callahan, Hughes, Mehta et al. And it found that out of 828 articles, which were cited by the National Professional Developmental Center on ASD and the NAC, only 221 of these articles, or 26%, demonstrated the direct evidence of the measurement of social validation, right? That's kind of crazy. Again, Wolf's paper came out in 1978. So how do we go from social validity is super important and all this great stuff coming from Wolf back then to 40 odd years, almost 50 years later, that it's not being looked at as much, as social validity is not being measured and really taken into account? That's a huge discrepancy, in my opinion. And so why I wanted to think about why that is. That gave me the rationale for putting this talk together and thinking about, why has that somehow become less important? Because I designed a study in 2010, 2011 for my master's thesis, and I absolutely measure social validity as a part of that. To me, that was integral into what I was doing, because my study involved teaching to adults on the spectrum how to ask someone out on a date, using a combination of a written checklist, role playing, and video modeling. So that's something that is overtly socially important. And I wanted to know that what I did helped these participants in some way. So I built that in to what I created, because I couldn't even fathom that not being a part of it. But in just a little over 10 years' time, it seems like the importance of social validity in the field has waned. And has waned among professionals and clinicians working directly with autistic individuals. And I'm really wanting to know why that is. So again, another quote from Wolf, and this, social validity is a collaborative effort between behavior analysts and clients to determine if the goals of a program are meaningful, the procedures of an intervention are appropriate, and whether the outcomes result in the client's well-being and happiness. It is an integral part of applied behavior analysis. So what I was just saying, right? This is not optional. Again, I think very often when we get kind of bogged down into the day-to-day of designing programs and trying to find ways to help autistic individuals, be in the classroom or on a job site or wherever it may be, we get fixed on that, I think, and we lose sight, like I said, of this larger picture of, is what we're doing really genuinely meaningful for this person, right? It could be meaningful for their employer, it could be meaningful for their parents, it could be meaningful for their peers, but does this mean something to the person that we're supposed to be helping? That piece just ends up missing all too often. And so I'll be, going into this in a little later in the presentation, but happiness is a measurement of social validity. We'll talk about why that is and how we can look at that. So this is me on my first day of school. I would say around 4th or 5th grade. And, one of the things that I always think about is how at this particular time, there were starting to be IEP meetings that were happening between my parents and the director of special education, and some of my teachers and other specialists who worked with me. And I would be asked to, be at these meetings for whatever reason. I don't know if it was immediately at this time, because I was diagnosed as autistic at the age of 11. So the meetings began, around that time. But I remember, that in the meetings themselves, everyone else was being asked about their opinions and thoughts, except for me. I might as well have been a potted plant for how much anybody asked me anything or cared about what I had to say. And I always remembered, because the meetings were held at the administrative offices at the elementary school. I remember looking out the window and seeing the blacktop and the sun shining down on it and hearing the kids playing and knowing that I wasn't out there with them. And so, if you were to ask me at this age, what's most socially valid to 11, 12-year-old Amy, what's socially valid to 11 and 12-year-old Amy is being able to play with the other kids, having friends, not being bullied every single day, not wanting to kill myself every single day, which was the place that I was in mentally and emotionally. But no one was looking at that. What was being looked at was, is Amy having meltdowns? Is Amy sitting quietly at her desk? Is Amy doing the work that she needs to be doing? Is Amy, not having sensory overload, as if anybody back then even understood sensory overload? It just there just wasn't that notion of happiness, like I mentioned, that notion of what matters to this kid sitting in front of you, right? And I think that's another piece of all of this, is that when we talk about social validity, so many people have in their heads picture of the autistic individual, child, adult that they want to have, rather than the autistic individual who is actually there in front of them, right? So we need to kind of move away from this. What is it, who is it that you think this individual should be, and who are they actually? And who can they be, right? Because again, the thing we often assume is that where somebody is when they're diagnosed as autistic is where they're always going to be. But we are capable of growing and changing as much as anyone. So, thinking about the future, I think would have made a huge difference to framing, what was socially valid, what would matter to me then, yes, in that moment at age 11, 12, but what would have also mattered in the future. But the fact was that all these professionals and experts were telling my parents that I wasn't going to have a future, that I wasn't going to do anything. So that made it that much harder, I think, than to really frame all of this, right? So that's the purpose I make in mentioning all of this and sharing that little piece of my own personal experience with you. But so then how do we make it meaningful, right? That was the thing that has been on my mind, that I, in thinking about my experience and my story, how do we make this meaningful, right? Well, when we talk about applied behavior analysis, I feel like the applied part often gets lost, right? And applied, it doesn't just mean how we apply the science of behavior analysis in this work that we're doing. be it with autistic individuals or with individuals with other disabilities or people without disabilities. It also means looking at how behavior analysis applies to the world we live in, right? I know not everybody who is here in the presentation today might have a background in behavior analysis, and that's okay. But to give you some kind of concept, a lot of the times I see this with behavior analysts where it's this thing of, oh, well, behavior analysis is so applicable to the world, and it's, you know, it's so important. How could anybody not think that ABA is the best thing since sliced bread and grilled cheese sandwiches and blah blah blah? But for something to be, you know, valid and to be applicable to the world, it has to be dynamic. It has to keep evolving, right? We can't just say, oh, this therapy or whatever you want to call it was developed, you know, 50 years ago, and it's been the best thing ever since. No, the world changes. We change. Autistic individuals change. How we view autism changes. And so the interventions and the things that we use to help individuals on the spectrum have to change as well. Because otherwise they won't be applicable to the world we live in anymore. Maybe it would still be applicable to how the world was 50 years ago, but that doesn't mean that it's going to stay relevant now, right? So, you know, autistic people as a whole have not always been considered to know what is best for us, right? So when we create programs and we set goals, very often autistic individuals are left out of that process or are thought of as ancillary to that process, and that's simply not true, right? Autistic individuals are crucial to this entire process. But this again speaks to this kind of paternalistic mindset that we see in a lot of mental health fields, where again the default is quote normal, neurotypical, and anyone who isn't that is therefore less than in some capacity and needs to be fixed somehow, right? And it's one thing entirely if someone who is autistic or someone who is part of a treatment program has things that they want to work on and things that they want to change. Absolutely. In no way will I ever say that an autistic person who wants to make changes or you know, set a goal that involves certain changes is wrong for doing that. But all too often those goals are set by others, and feedback from the client themselves is not incorporated. You know, social validity is so essential to this process, right? So it improves all of the buy-in in this, right? It's not, again, it's not just something that happens in the moment, right? It's a long-term investment. It really is. And if you show someone that you are, you know, you're willing to say, okay, I did this program, and I'm not just going to say that it was perfect and everything was fine. I want to make sure that it mattered and it was socially valid. I think that will improve that buy-in. It will make people more likely to be like, okay, I'm more on board with this because you're not just standing here in front of me saying I'm the big honk expert and this is a good intervention because I said so, right? It's that you're willing to say that yes, obviously we want to create programs that are the most effective possible and that are going to you know, run flawlessly and seamlessly. But to me, it's a sign of true professionalism and strength to be able to say, you know, maybe something maybe may not have gone the way we hoped. How can we improve that? What could we do differently? How can we make sure this is valid for the people we're trying to help, both now and in the future, should we attempt to use this program again, right? So this pays dividends, right? Measuring social validity now ensures that the autistic clients that you're going to be supporting down the line will benefit and will not, you know, will benefit the most. That's really what we're talking about. So, you know, again, social validity, as we talked about before, has different dimensions to it that were outlined by Wolf in his paper. But to me, there's also a different kind of topographies that social validity can take on. And when I think about it, you know, we often see social validity framed as this idea about reducing risk, right? But not all programs and not all things that we do should be about reducing risk for autistic individuals, right? Because life is inherently full of risk. That's what it means to be alive. That's what it means to be a human being. And so rather than eliminating risk entirely, which I think ultimately can actually be harmful in some ways, it should be about how do we help autistic individuals navigate risk? How do we allow autistic individuals the dignity of risk, which is a phrase that I use, which to me refers to that there are things that we're trying to help autistic individuals do that may cause harm. So, for example, dating, relationships, right? That's my area primarily of research and focus. And that, of course, carries a risk with it. Someone might get their heart broken. Someone might, you know, pardon me, that was a call I couldn't reach. That was okay. So threw me off a little bit there, but we're back on track. So yeah, so these are things that carry an inherent risk with them, and I know there's so much fear, right? There's fear that exists, especially among parents. So I don't want my child to potentially get hurt, of course, but you can't put somebody in a bubble so that nothing will ever happen to them, because then nothing will ever happen to them, right? And that's not how we learn to thrive and exist in this world long after you're no longer here with us. So social validity can, again, like I said, look like not eliminating risk entirely, but helping autistic people navigate risk successfully. It can also, it's also important to bear in mind that social validity is not a static thing, right? Again, we tend to think of it as, okay, I'm measuring social validity at this one point and that's it. Okay, it's done. And not so, right? Social validity is fluid. Things change with between when we perhaps start a program versus at the end of that program versus 6 months after the end of that program, right? So we have to be continuously monitoring social validity, looking at how that progresses and how that changes as time goes on. I'll talk about that more in a minute as well. And again, this goes back to what I touched on earlier about happiness being a measure of social validity. It absolutely is. It needs to be. How do we frame that, right? So we again, it's happiness can look like many different things. It can be like a physical expression of happiness, like smiling, like someone laughing a lot, right? Those are kind of more overt signs of happiness. But happiness can also refer to quality of life, right? How does the quality of life improve and change for someone through the measurement of social validity? How do we look at a program, an intervention, whatever you want to call it, and say, is this making this person happy? And again, I know we might say, like for example, when I go to the doctor, it's you're not necessarily happy in the moment that you're getting a colonoscopy, right? But in the end, you're happy because it turns out that you don't have cancer, right? So happiness, it may not be something that's necessarily visible in that moment, but it's an overarching principle, is the point. Is the person happy either as a result of what you did, or the the effects that carried over from what you did in the long run? That to me is essential and ties into social validity inherent. Because if what we're doing isn't making people happy, then why are we doing it? Right? I think that I mean, when I think about my childhood and me as an autistic child, and that my overall kind of viewpoint of the world was an unhappy one. So what does that mean? Well, I had moments of happiness. Certainly, it's not as if I was miserable 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, but I was not what I would describe as happy overall. As I mentioned, I was suicidal for many years, from third grade up until I graduated high school. And for something to have changed that, to have genuinely made me happy, I wish there had been some kind of program or someone who had done something to do that, because that didn't exist for me as a kid. I mean, there were people who tried to help me. Certainly, I had a wonderful guidance counselor in elementary school, but to shift my overarching worldview from one of unhappiness to happiness, that takes work, right? That's a hard thing. It's very easy to say, oh, well, look, like the person is smiling, so therefore they're happy right now. But that doesn't necessarily translate to how someone, feels in that overarching sense. And right. So how do we shift that? And that's a lot harder, right? When someone's day to day is such a struggle as mine was. So yeah, so looking at social validity through the lens of happiness, to me is a huge component of this. And again, this is another quote from Wolf that again ties into what I've been trying to say. They would ask us, how do you know what skills to teach? You talk about appropriate skills this and appropriate skills that. How do you know that these are really appropriate? We of course tried to explain that we were psychologists and thus the most qualified judges of what was best for people. Somehow they didn't seem convinced by that logic. And I love this quote because again, it resonates right into the present day, right? We're seeing this right now still, that so many people feel that they know what is best for an autistic individual. But very frequently, we as individuals on the spectrum are not viewed as the judges of what is best for us, right? But I think that could be said of neurotypicals as well. Do all neurotypicals always know what's best for them? It depends, I think, but it can't be this thing where we're always relying on someone external to us to tell us what's best for us, right? It diminishes that sense of self-awareness and of getting to know who you are. And it's and it's all predicated as well on the fact that we're saying that these experts and people understand autism better from an external perspective than from people who live with it every single day. And I think, again, I would say that it's two different kinds of knowledge, right? There's certainly plenty of knowledge that you can acquire from studying autism and learning about autism and how it works, and what are things that autistic individuals experience. But there's an entirely different knowledge that is gleaned from living with that diagnosis every day. And I've been in the position of sitting in my grad school classes or sitting in other environments and hearing people talking about how my own brain works. And it's very weird to have other people talking about that in front of you as if you're kind of not there, you know what I mean? And it's not that I'm not grateful for the insights that many people have. I think it benefits us all to hear what things look like from an external perspective. But all too often when we are talking about autism, it's those external perspectives that supplant and override the internal experience of many autistic individuals. So if we want what we do to be the most socially valid programs that we can come up with, we have to be taking into account the perspectives of the people who are living with autism, who are autistic ourselves. So that kind of brings us to, again, when we talk about collecting social validity and measuring it, the barriers that might exist. And as I mentioned earlier, these barriers are not created, I think, by autistic people, and certainly not in any kind of deliberate sense. These often can be environmental. They can arise from a number of different sources, but we'll talk about a few of them. So as we were saying, in the last decade, the field has moved away from collecting social validity. Why could this be? Again, thinking about external, barriers, it seems from what, again, I don't work in a school, well, I work at Rutgers, but I don't work in like an elementary school or school district. And it seems that, so many interventionists, BCBAs, who, OTs, whoever is working directly with autistic individuals are very overworked, right? There's a lot of demands on people's time and not a lot of, capacity for people to fulfill those demands. And so people are brought in, or there's a huge demand for behavior analysts, for example, but there aren't enough people to fulfill that demand. So you have people coming in to take on these roles who may not be fully trained and who may not understand how exactly to support autistic individuals, which is to the detriment of the entire field, I might add. But then because of that, you have people who are there, just trying to get the job done, basically. And get the job done might be okay for some things. It's not okay when we're talking about supporting autistic individuals. It is not enough to simply get the job done, or at least I hope it wouldn't be. It's about so much more than just the bare minimum, or again, at least it should be. So, but it stems as well from the fact that there tends to be that disconnect. We've seen this, we see this frequently, not only between BCBAs and autistic individuals and the community, between parents and the autistic community as well. Over, again, that idea of who knows best, who knows inherently what is the right thing for an autistic individual. And again, it's, I always wrestle with this as well, because I understand where the autistic community is coming from, certainly. And I just spoke to the importance of listening to people with lived experience. At the same time, there's no way for an entire community to know what a specific child or individual situation is and what they really need, it's so, and when we well, especially when you hear these things happening on and see these things happening on social media, people get really, really loud about things they really, really don't understand. And that is a problem, right? It doesn't encourage communication. It only makes communication break down when we have these clashes happening and this disconnect happening. So it I think all too often it makes the people who are working directly with autistic individuals say, well, these people are on Twitter and they have no idea what is happening and everything I'm trying to do with the kids or the students that I'm working with. So I'm not even going to bother listening to them, and the heck with it, which again is not a good thing necessarily, but I think then that can make it difficult for people to, because then the idea can also be, well, if what I do is only important if it's socially valid to this whole community of people, I can't possibly make an entire community of people happy, so I'm not even going to worry about it. And it's this idea of extremes, right? We tend to see things happening in extremes on one end or the other, and that's not, most of us exist somewhere in the middle, right? Extremes on either side are not a good thing. But it turns into this very black and white thing, which ultimately is harmful for the very people that we're trying to support. And again, another, I think, tremendous barrier that comes up is measuring and collecting social validity with non-speaking clients, right? We will see people who are supporting folks on the spectrum who may not be speaking, and then we'll say, well, this person I'm working with doesn't talk, so how am I supposed to collect social validity? And that's, of course, I mean, there's a million ways to collect social validity from non-speaking folks, and that gets us into the area of consent and assent, which I will continue on our next slide. And so, again, thinking about consent, right? It's an ongoing thing. Consent doesn't just happen once, right? We don't simply obtain somebody's consent at the beginning of a program and assume that will carry through every single thing that we're doing. We want to continue measuring that to make sure that the individuals we're supporting are continuing to consent to what we're doing, right? Because things can change, right? The protocols that we put in place at one point might suddenly shift if we're thinking, oh, this isn't really working so well, and now I want to try to tweak this. You need to check in with the client you're supporting, right? You need to make sure that you do that along the way. And in the same vein, social validity should be ongoing too, right? So let's say you get to the end of a program that you've implemented and you have found, that it seems to have worked, right? But you want to keep checking that. You want, what was socially valid about it for that person or their family or the community, whatever it may be. It may not end up being as valid maybe 6 months down the line, right? So always looking to see that what you're doing has that sense of generalization, that it carries through somebody's life as well in different facets. Is it valid not just for them perhaps in the classroom, but for this client at home? Is it valid for them in the community, right? All these things matter. And when we talk about obtaining consent or assent, which is what is often the term used when we're talking about individuals who are non-speaking, it's not always straightforward, right? We know that this is complicated. We know that, especially for people who do not speak, that it may be more challenging. But there are ways that you can obtain that assent if you want to, right? Perhaps using a visual guide to obtaining assent can be helpful. Using visual aids is one possibility. Using even a video, and then so that somebody can watch that and then nod or press a button on the screen. There's all kinds of different ways that you can try to obtain that assent, and it's essential, right? Even though it's not always easy. What's the saying that not everything worth doing is easy, right? But it is essential. And it's because when we're looking at outcomes, right, it's very easy to see what you want to see instead of seeing what is actually happening. And so what do we mean by that? There's a lot of things that we mean by that, but when I think of this, that incongruity, many people on the spectrum tend to be people pleasers, right? A lot of us, we again, this comes from a lot of different places, but I know for me growing up, I wanted to make the adults around me happy. I cared far more about the input and validation from the adults around me than I did from my own peers. I mean, I've never gotten along with kids my own age. I don't know why. But when I saw that I could make adults happy, of course, it made me more inclined to want to do things, quote, right. And we tend to conflate somebody wanting to make others happy with that person themselves being happy, right? So we have to make that distinction. And what might be socially valid to the provider in that moment, it may not be a good thing for the client, right? So again, that's what we're talking about with why consent ties into that. Let me just look at my last slide for a second. Okay, so the outcomes that you as a clinician might see might be great for you, and it's very easy to just make that assumption and think that this is a good thing, right? What I'm seeing looks as if it's helped this individual and it's made a change and a difference in their lives. But again, that doesn't necessarily equate to it being a good thing for that client in the long run or within themselves, right? And again, an example of that, sometimes we tend to look at data, right? And we tend to think that a high rate of responding is the same thing as social validity, right? If you look at a graph and you see that someone in baseline has a low rate of responding, and then you go to generalization and there's a high rate of responding, it can be very easy to assume, oh, this is great. This means that it worked and that this was socially valid. Not the case. Not always the case, right? That high rate of responding may just be the person, again, trying to make the adult working with them happy, because that's where many of us are coming from. It could also be an indication of something else that's going on. The fear of making a mistake. Well, what'll happen if I don't respond in the way that this adult is wanting me to respond? All those things tie into what we're talking about. So these are, just such important things to keep in mind. And especially again, when we're talking about that idea of consent and assent. And it's like, well, I don't want to give that example. That's good. But we might think, that high rate of responding could correlate to somebody continuing to give consent to what is happening. But what if that high rate of responding is coming from fear? What if the person, like I said before, if the person is afraid and they're trying really hard to just wanting to get or from anxiety, right? So people can engage in high rates of responding out of, it could be an anxiety response, but that doesn't mean that that's a good thing, right? So we all too often it's easy to conflate those two things and think one means something that it doesn't. So we have to really be intentional and careful about that when we're creating programs and when we're thinking about how we're looking at social validity, right? And how it's framed around ensuring that what we're doing is helping autistic individuals as much as possible and not unintentionally causing, again, those potentially harmful long-term effects, right? So just to continue on with this about the high rate of responding, let's say somebody completes a program and then at the end of it, okay, the data looks great and they have a high rate of responding. Oh, yay, this is socially valid. But meanwhile, the client, the child, the individual is completely burned out because what they've actually been doing over the course of the program is performing, right? Maybe it's not that the program actually worked in the way that we want to hope that it did, that the individual is performing again for that adult, right? Wanting to please that person, wanting to just get through it, right? So it's we have to always remember that data don't always tell the full story. We have to be looking at the individual that's in front of us and not the one that we want to be seeing in front of us, right? That goes back to what I was saying earlier. So just something really important to keep in mind. Again, thinking about collaboration, right? So, when we talk about, engaging with social validity and collaborating with clinicians and parents, right? It becomes, like I had said before, all too commonly this thing where we're looking at what the parent thinks is important, right? And that doesn't always align with what the client is saying is important to them, saying it either, explicitly, overtly, or saying it through other means. I have experienced this many times. I am a consultant through my organization, Ascot Consulting, and I work with clients on the spectrum in areas related to sexuality and relationships. And I can't tell you how many times I would have an adult client, come to my office with a parent, and what the parent tells me they think is the priority for this individual in their life is often completely different from what the client, the individual, tells me is most important to them. So that those things don't, excuse me, always align. Um, and we always have to be keeping that in mind when we are kind of collaborating again with parents, especially on making sure that a program is socially valid. And again, going back to what we talked about goal setting and the goals that we set. If we, I think, initially involve autistic people in the creation of goals, these things will be inherent, but all too often they're not, right? So is the goal that we've set, is it something that upholds the rights of autistic people? Right? What does that mean? I'm talking about human rights, right? I'm talking about, are we making sure that someone's dignity is being taken into account? And I know that sounds really basic, and we would think that that's something everybody would be concerned about and would be looking at when designing programs, but it's not always the case, right? Furthermore, does the goal promote self-advocacy, right? So when we're talking about these interventions and these things that we're doing, I always feel that the kind of ultimate piece of social validity is, does this ultimately allow this individual to advocate for themselves for this thing down the line, right? That's again talking about what we said earlier about the future, because when you as the parent or you as the clinician are no longer in the life of this individual, they need to be able to advocate for themselves and be able to get those needs met, right? So that's socially valid in and of itself. So I feel that's just a huge piece that I think we need to focus on more when we're talking, about creating these programs. And I think part of the way that we can do this, we need to kind of incentivize social validity in some ways. We shouldn't have to. I don't know that there's any way you can, do something where you can give somebody a $25 Amazon gift card if they make sure to include social validity in the treatment that they're designing. I think that counts as like bribery or something. But so let's stay away from that. But what we can do is make social validity valuable and essential to the field of applied behavior analysis, right? We need to make social validity valuable and essential to every field. Now, not just ABA. But we need to be able to say that it's not enough that we're just coming up with stuff to do to work with autistic individuals. We need to know that it matters now and it matters in the long run, and that the field of work that we're part of is somehow less if we don't undertake social validity measures, right? Which I feel it is. I feel that any field that involves working directly with autistic individuals, whether it is ABA, whether it's OT, whether it's speech pathology, any field is much less well off if they don't include social validity. That's to me, and to me alone as a professional, I would not want to be a part of something that was not including that in what they're doing. So that's another consideration. Again, then thinking about social validity in collaboration with autistic individuals, right? How can we start to do that? How can we look at that? One thing that comes to my mind is, collecting social validity data during and after interventions. I've been saying this throughout this presentation, that it's an ongoing process, right? It's not just something that happens once. It should be continuous. This again, as I said before, will help us ensure that autistic individuals are still engaged with the programs that we're putting together, and that it matters to the very person that we're attempting to support, as well as creating those conditions under which people on the spectrum can be assumed to be the best evaluators of their own needs, preferences, and post-treatment satisfaction. Right? Again, I know this might seem like a tall order, right? We might say, my kid barely knows like what the right shirt is to wear based on how the weather is outside. Okay, but there's different types of if there's different types of what we call intelligences too, right? Though there's book intelligence and there's common sense intelligence. And I know for myself, I can say I'm not always the best with common sense at times. I have had my moments, but I feel that I'm a relatively intelligent person book wise, and that I would want to be engaged with this. I would want to be looked at as, not just a subject, not just someone who is the recipient of treatments, but somebody who is a part of, the things that I'm receiving, right? It's a very, I can distinctly remember as a kid being surrounded by people in white lab coats when I was undergoing biofeedback, and their faces are less distinct to me than the front of those lab coats and the white buttons on them and the clipboards that those adults were holding. And you feel very, very small in an environment like that. You feel that, you are just trying to do what you're being told to do, and that you don't have that control over what is happening to you. And that's a really vulnerable place to be in, right? That's the thing, is that, these interventions, right, these things that we're doing them with probably one of the most vulnerable groups of people in the world, right? And anyone with any, I think, mental health challenges, but especially when we're talking about individuals with developmental disabilities and autism, it's for someone to be in that position. There's so much trust that is happening. We as autistic individuals are asked to trust people who are implementing these programs. I would ask you to trust us similarly, right? So what's that mean? It means that neither you nor we have all the answers, but together, working together, listening to each other, we can make this, something that is meaningful for the individuals that we're supporting, right? That's the way that we can do it. It's not by one side lecturing to the other about what's best. It's about coming together, right? And saying, I want these conditions to exist where you are able to give this input and this information. How do we make that happen? How do we make that possible? And again, thinking about, this collaboration with autistic individuals, what is socially important to autistic people, right? That's kind of missing a lot too, right? So social validity isn't just about what's important to society as a whole, because there are, there's an autistic community out there, right? So what is something the community looks at as socially important? Again, I think you're going to find a lot of different answers to that. Obviously, not everybody's going to agree on what's socially important, but bearing in mind that only because your clients that you're supporting are part of that community too. And again, how they're a part of that is up to each individual. Obviously, it's not going to be the same for every person, but just thinking about what is important to the community, right? Because we talk about social competence, right? We talk about this when we talk about creating programs and interventions for people from different cultural backgrounds, right? In some capacities, autism there's a culture of autism that exists, right? So how does what you're doing relate to autistic culture? How is it valid, both for larger society and the culture that the person you're working with is a part of, in whatever capacity they may be a part of it. And of course, thinking about social validity within the community, right? So again, we tend to frame social validity as something, within certain confines, right? Whether it be at school, at the workplace, or at home. But we as autistic people do exist in the community, right? We and that seems to often be missing from the conversation, right? So how do we bridge that gap? How do we say, that we want to look at members of the community and okay, stumbling over my word, but we want to see that the community is benefiting as well as the individual, right? So we know, or at least we should know, that all communities benefit by having autistic people in them. I believe that they do. Maybe I'm biased, but I think that every community benefits from having autistic people in it and embracing those people. But how does that happen? And how do we look at what it is we're doing and say that this is being able to be extrapolated into the community? How does the intervention benefit that community ultimately, right? I'm not saying that that should be the sole focus of what we're doing, but I think it gives us a lens again through which to examine what it is we're doing, and think about how it extends again beyond that day to day, which I mentioned earlier. So this is one final quote again from Montrose's paper that I really loved and thought was really significant. It may be that they don't know when they are better or worse off. It may be that to expect a human ever to be able to report accurately when something feels good or feels bad is just more than we can hope for from our confused species. But this conclusion is unacceptable if our goal is to design a responsive, consumer-oriented, applied social science, right? Again, it may be very difficult for anyone, whether you're autistic or not, to talk with any accuracy about your experiences in depth or about what it is that you think you need. But if we're looking at undertaking the process of helping autistic individuals to thrive and be successful in school, at home, and in the community, we have to be looking at that full picture in totality. We have to be looking at how we can view autistic individuals as an authority on their experiences, not maybe as the sole authority, but as people who are able to say, this is me, this is my life, what I'm experiencing matters, and not just what other people are saying that I'm experiencing in the reports that we're writing, right? So just letting our voices be voices that are upheld and that matter in these conversations that we're having. So I hope that this has been helpful for you. I hope it's given you a look into social validity and why this is important. Again, this is an ongoing process. The answers are not something that any one person has, but it is essential, if what we're doing is to benefit autistic people as much as possible, that we never lose sight of the importance of social validity and that we never view it as optional, because it is essential. So thank you all so much for your time and attention. This is my contact information. You scan the QR code, it'll take you to my social media pages. And now we can go to questions.
Awesome. Okay, thank you, Amy. So if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to post those in the webinar chat. And I just want to thank you, Amy, for your presentation, for another valuable presentation today. We're always excited to hear from you. And like I said, we are having Amy as our keynote speaker at our autism conference. Let me go ahead and put that in the link to that in the chat here. You can find information about it on our website, but you can also register on the A+ website, which is here. Let me put that in the chat. And if anyone wants to raise their hand, they can feel free to do so, and I can unmute you if you'd like to ask a question live to Amy, or you can just post in the chat. But again, the link I just put in the chat was for the autism conference, if you would like to register for that. And then you can also find all of our monthly webinars on our website, and I'll put the direct link to that in the chat. And that's where you'll find today's recording if you feel like someone on your team or in your administration would benefit from it. And you can also register for our future webinars. We have a webinar coming up on April 16th regarding disability and financial support. How do we pay for all this? And that will be presented by Carrie Magro. We're welcoming him back. And then we also have one on June 11th presented by Carrie Magro, and that will be managing anxiety in autistic children and adults. And then we will be, both of those registrations are already up on our website, which I just put here in the chat for you if you'd like to go ahead and register for those dates. And then we will also be welcoming Amy Gravino back in May to speak about women and autism. And that registration will be coming shortly to you all. You'll see the emails go out for that. If you're not signed up for our added emails, please go ahead and do so. You should have had the question if you wanted to sign up for them on today's registration. So I'll make sure I get that. If you went ahead and answered those, we'll put you on our email list. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or you can post in the chat. I don't see any coming through and no one's raising their hand, but we'll give them a couple more seconds. Amy, did you have any last minute comments or any like disclaimers or little previews about what they can expect from you at the conference or anything like that?
Sure. Well, I'll be, excited to talk about sexuality again, and I don't have any filter that I'm aware of, so you can ask me anything that you want, that you feel comfortable with, either here now in today's webinar or at the conference coming up. I'm excited that I'll be talking about the sex ed curriculum that I just developed through my work at Rutgers through a grant that I received, my first as a principal investigator, and we've just completed it and run the group. So I'll be going into detail about what that looked like and what the hopes are for that for the future. So, okay. Oh, we have a question in the chat. Can you give a few more examples of how to include students in their programming and goals when they have limited ability to communicate those things? Sure, Sarah. So again, one of the suggestions I gave was about something visual. I think, the place I always start to look at is somebody's interests, right? I start looking at what is it that somebody has shown an interest in? What do they have? And again, it's funny when we talk about autistic individuals, we talk about specialized interests, but neurotypicals are allowed to have passions, right? For autistic people, those are our passions, right? So finding kind of I think through somebody's passions is a good starting place. And saying, okay, this is what's relevant and valid to this person, and how can we find a way to tie this to goals that we're looking at, right? I think I know why people often, we forget that communication comes in many different forms and ways as well, other than verbal. I think that, boy, like, for example, even giving someone a choice is the most kind of, basic example of this. Like we conduct preference assessments, right? We see, like, do you, the very basic level, do you like M&M's or do you like Skittles, right? Someone can just point to one or the other. So if you can give someone a choice, you can incorporate somebody in the goal planning. I think, just kind of, like laying it out, just really very simply, like, do you like this or that? Like, or if you give someone the choice, do you want to wear the red shirt or the blue shirt today? Right? Somebody can pick out, then they can point. So just, like finding the inroads into that, I think. And also, having someone who might be able to be a liaison for that person too. That's something I've done in my capacity as a consultant, which is speaking not necessarily on behalf of, but in collaboration with an autistic individual who may have difficulty communicating some of those things. Having someone who is word just flew out of my head again, but somebody who is an advocate, and I know we would say that would be a parent typically, but it might be good to have, someone who is kind of an objective third party, right? Because again, a parent is going to have specific things that they're going to want to include in the programming and in the goals. So having somebody who is a third party who can, even work to help the individual communicate what their goals are could also be significant. Also, if you have students who use AAC devices in some capacity, that can be a way to include people in goal setting. So those are some potential ways of doing it. And I can refer you to some other people who have more ideas than I do about that if you're interested. So just let me know. You're welcome.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. Any other questions or comments? Any? I don't see any in the chat or anything, so we'll go ahead and close out. Amy, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it. Again, we hope you register for our autism conference. We're really looking forward to it. We're going to have Hallie Moss, Amy Gravino. We're also going to have some breakout sessions. There's going to be vendors there. And then we're also going to have lunch, and it's a full day conference. So we're excited to have that for all of you. We hope you register. Again, I put that link in the chat. And also I put the link to our monthly webinars where you can register for our future sessions. Our May session will be coming soon. That will be Women in Autism. And then we have our April and June session up already. All right, I'll go ahead and close this out. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your Wednesday.
Thanks, everyone.